Rosenfeld today, who is a UKCP therapist and also author of a beautiful memoir called The State of Disbelief, about when she lost her wonderful husband to lung cancer in 2015. So I'm really looking forward to talking to you about grief. I know that sounds a very strange thing to say, Juliet, but I find that a lot of people don't know how to talk about grief. A lot of people, the one person I've really enjoyed talking to about this subject is Cheryl Strayed, who wrote the memoir Wild. I don't know whether if you read that. But she is able to capture, as you do in your book, the kind of raw devastation that people talk about when they talk about grief. And I think so many people kind of, if they haven't experienced grief, they don't know really how to talk about it, how to verbalize it, what's okay, what's not okay. I mean, I lost both my parents to cancer when I was a teenager. So for me, being able to talk to people about grief and the real trauma of it is such a relief, to be honest. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for writing your memoir.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me. And I'm a big fan of Psychologies, as you know.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, you're right that, I mean, the first thing is that grief is bereavement, which begins with grief, generally, for most people, is an anomalous experience. There's nothing really else like it, I think, in life in terms of a loss, because a person has gone. I mean, they've dematerialized. That's just very complex to take in, to really understand that, even though it's so factual, is just very difficult to process. So I think that's one of the big problems, is that as an experience, as a personal experience, in some ways, I think that until you've experienced a close bereavement yourself, it is quite difficult to know what it feels like.
Yeah, it is. But I mean, there's two things I want to talk to you about today. One is obviously we're in the middle of this huge crisis. People are very close to death. You know, they're frightened of losing people. They may be even ill themselves. So one is, how do we process our own grief, and how do we help other people to support them properly when they are going through a state of grief? I think there's so many ways of not to do that. But first of all, if someone's watching this broadcast and has just lost someone, I mean, where do we start? What hand would you reach out? How could you help those people? What would you say to them?
Well, I mean, I think the first point is that, to begin with, and sometimes for quite a long time afterwards, very little actually changes anything about the experience of grief. I think it's very difficult to do things that that sort of mitigate how appallingly painful it is. I found that my experience was, you know, I was a quite experienced psychotherapist, used to working with grief in my consulting room. But when I became a victim of grief, I really was blinded by it. And I think another complicating factor is that you do feel as if you're in a different world to everybody else. It's my experience. And yet, you know, life goes on pretty quickly. You know, go back to work, children taken on the school run, whatever it is, real life kind of continues very quickly. So I think one of the really helpful things is understanding that for somebody suddenly finding themselves bereaved, that the experience is much more protracted, generally, much longer than perhaps those of us, you know, viewing it from the outside can know. It's very invisible grief. And we certainly don't really have any visible signs of grieving, you know, unlike the Victorians who widows wore black. We don't do anything like that. Feel very alone and deeply isolated. I think that being able to just know and let someone know that you understand that this will go on for quite a long time is really important. I think that not expecting someone to feel better And sometimes not asking, are you feeling better, is also really important. I think that being told you're strong, again, you know, the implication is that if you're strong, then you're going to get to now the other side. And for a long time, people just don't, they really can't see, you know, they don't have any sense that this is going to change at all, because the person that they loved most in the world is not there anymore. I mean, it's immense as a loss. And that's what I mean about bereavement being unlike any other loss. It's the enormity of it. And I think understanding the enormity of it and just being able to sit with that with somebody is very, very important.
Yeah. I think I really resonate with what you're saying about that life goes on. You know, I always remember sort of walking along the streets and going, all of these people are just going business as usual. Don't they know, you know, don't they know that my whole world has collapsed? And this kind of, I mean, my thing was rage. I mean, the anger that I felt. So people couldn't get near me anyway. I mean, how do you process rage, that kind of anger you feel at losing someone, that people don't understand your pain, so you become this spiky, unhelpful, you know, people can't help you because you're so kind of furious. How do we deal with anger?
Well, you're right that people are furious, but also very cut off, and they feel very, very separated from everybody else. You know, one of the things I see in my consulting room is a sense of feeling as if, you know, you are in a room with other people, but you're all on your own in it. And so that experience that you talk about, sort of walking down the street and, you know, life is going on totally as normal, feels like another real insult. I remember thinking that kind of good weather felt like an insult, you know. And I think that's true, that the anger is very, very difficult. And again, I think though it's very idiosyncratic, it's very personal to you know, to the person that it happens to. And I think this is another aspect of bereavement that I, you know, became very interested in. I'd always been interested in it professionally, and then I became even more interested in it, which was that some sort of expectation that that there would be stages of grief. That, you know, that was not my experience, and I think equally that anger that comes along can really come at any time. Some people feel it much earlier, and I think some people don't feel it in a different way. I think that it again is something that has to be sort of tolerated by people around you, as, you know, part of the enormity of this sort of state. You know, it's why I think, you know, when I first started writing, which was the thing I started doing, don't quite know why, I still don't quite know why, but it was better than nothing. And one of the things I kept on thinking was, you know, this is a state of disbelief, is what I called the book that, because I just could not believe that I was in this strange alien place where, as you say, no one could get through to me. And you know, in some ways I didn't really want to get through to anyone else, because to do that would have been, in a way, leaving my loved one. And I think that there is something about grief as a kind of protective state, in a way, where you are still connecting with the person that is gone, but it is unutterably painful because they're not there anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it is that thing of a friend of mine recently sort of said, you know, she lost her mum, and it's my mum, and all I want to do is ring her and tell her, Mum, this terrible thing has happened. And then realizing over and over again, oh, it actually makes me upset thinking about it, you know, that she can't contact her mum, you know, and it's just that devastation over and over again that person isn't there for you. They say that grief is the price we pay for love, and I love that phrase, because it's a kind of almost an honoring of the love that you've had. But I think there's also a danger that we kind of hold on to our grief, because it's almost, if we don't hold on to our grief, then it means we love them less or something. I really struggled with that. I really held on to it for a long, long time. How do we kind of, it's not like a new normal, is it? It's almost, how are we not destroyed by it? I mean, you're here 5 years on, you know, you've written a book. What what hope can you give us, or for the people
Mm.
on this broadcast, of the way through this? So there is no one way for anyone. I'm hearing you say it's awful. Yes.
Yes, I am saying that.
Yeah. What's at the what's at the other end of it?
Well, first of all, that line which you quoted is so beautiful, and it's not mine. It's Julian Barnes's from his book Levels of Life, which I talked about in my book, and which I found very helpful, and I've gone back to. And I think it's a very beautiful line, because it's a very true line. It is the price we pay for love. That the depth of the investment in the person, you can't just pull yourself out of it. There's nothing that can hurry up something that was so embedded in you and in the other person. I think that I've got sort of three thoughts really on how does one get through it. I think the first is accepting that it does take much longer than probably anyone around you or you would want it to. And I think that's perhaps a bit blunt to say that, but I think it's true. I think that trying to hurry it up, doesn't work, and that's something that I think as a society we find quite difficult. I think there is something contagious, sort of anxiety provoking about grief, and that's why very well-meaning, loving people around the griever often want to kind of continually check in and see whether they're feeling any better, when actually you don't see a light at the end of the tunnel. I think that on a practical level, what helped me was someone listening and just being very available to listen, not to interpret. And part of my discovery, if you like, in thinking about this, both as a professional, as a psychotherapist, but also as a widow, was that actually starting anything like counselling or psychotherapy, in my case, I wished I'd done a bit later. For quite a long time, what I wanted to do was just talk. I wanted to just talk. I wanted to talk about Andrew. And I think having somebody who can just tolerate you talking and going over and over and over and over again, what could have been different, what you might have done, what you didn't say. Now I look back and I think that was very cool. And I had one or two very good friends who just, I think now how very, very lucky I was. And I was very lucky. I have lovely mum and dad who also were very good at just listening, endlessly listening to me. Because I think one of the other problems is that because grief is so difficult, sort of a terrible part of it is that people they want it to be gone. They want it to be past. And eventually people do get bored with listening. And so I think friend, or if available, you're ready for it, a counsellor or a psychotherapist that just listens, that doesn't do too much there's nothing to interpret. The person's dead, and I think that the power of just listening is so important, and that I think can really, really help. And just being prepared to listen to the same thing, if necessary, 100 times, and if necessary, in 10 years' time, to say, I'm here. And I know when it happened, but if you want to talk to me now, 10 years time about it, I'm definitely here to listen. Yeah. And then I think, and just one other thing that I practically found helpful, I said earlier, was writing. I did start writing. I don't really know why. I mean, I'd always written a bit clinically, but I started just writing things down. And I think that was, I read a lovely line in another a brilliant book, actually, if anyone is interested in a really good book about grief, which is called The Lost Properties of Love, which I'd highly recommend, by Sophie Ratcliffe. One of the things that Sophie said was writing is better than thin air. And it's a wonderful thought. There's a bit of paper with some words on which have meaning for you. And, in my case, I was very lucky and that became, a book. But just writing, you don't have to be writing to anybody, but that somehow was a help for me. Particularly, I found reading quite difficult in the first year, and a lot of people find reading really difficult. And listening sometimes is easier. And eventually, I did start listening a lot to talking books and the radio. So those are sort of practical things. But my real message is that it is a very, very long and painful journey, and that the more that I think society can kind of tolerate that, and thinking about this, you know, this just enormous numbers of people who are now finding themselves bereaved, that trying to hold on to the fact that each one of those is a mom or a dad or a brother or a sister or a treasured friend, just trying to kind of you know, hold them as individuals in your mind, and accept that this is going to take much longer than one would think is really important.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're so right. I think there's a piece about it's very difficult for people to, it's almost like society's acknowledgement of grief kind of closes you down to a certain effect. As you say, when you feel so awful and you want to talk about it, almost people shy away. They can't bear it. And then one of the things that I've always tried to do ever since I lost my parents is always, if someone is grieving, is to reach out to them and you know, try and be there, because I know that generally if you haven't experienced grief, people kind of, they may want to help, but they it's almost like they can't bear it because of what it may trigger in them. So the acknowledging someone's grief and being there to listen and hear that, I think, is one of the greatest gifts that you can give.
Definitely.
Absolutely. Reading, you know, so reading your book, reading for me Cheryl Strayed's Wild was huge for me, because then I had this, she was so upset about losing her mother. She was literally the ashes of her mother, you know, it was extreme, but I'm like, yeah, she gets it. She gets how awful this is. And for your book, there's some incredibly moving, you know, pieces in your, how it really feels. And it kind of, yes, this is how painful this is. This is the, you know, and again, it makes you feel not so alone. And I think we've got one of our life-being experts, Anne Thorne, and you know, who lost her son to suicide, and she was saying that by writing, she started a blog and she started writing. She's written for Psychologies before, and by writing and sharing this, it really helped her, and it sounds like it's helped you too. So whether you're a writer or not, you know, publication or not, but to, as you say, to write something and to get that out, it's good. So in terms of you and your own grief process, how is it for you now? How are you now?
I'm pretty well. I feel as if the process was it long. I don't really think about it in terms of time. I think about a lot with patients is not saying, did it take a long time? Did you get over it? I think you have to throw out the rules of sort of temporality and what it means. I think that I went through a period which I would call grief followed by mourning. And I was, you know, eventually really helped by psychoanalysis. But it took about 3 years before I really felt that was something that was making a difference. I gave up my own psychoanalysis after 2 years because I didn't feel it was helping. And I think that can be an experience. I think, you know, going too early to something when you're still in a state of shock is not necessarily helpful. Which may sound strange for a psychotherapist to say, but I don't think that psychotherapy should be a sort of immediate prescription. I think it's when somebody feels ready for it, you know, and if it's available. But my writing help? Yes, I think it did. And I suppose, you know, a silver lining of this for me, if there aren't really silver linings, are there? But is that I think it has very much changed the way that I work with people that I see that are bereaved. I feel that I understand it in a way that I didn't before. And it's a subject that I find very, very interesting, painful, but interesting. And I also think it's a subject that as a society, the more that we are able to somehow to open it up, as it seems to me we can do with so many other subjects nowadays, the greater the impact that will be. It's a universal experience, and you know that most of us will be bereaved at some stage, and the more I think we try and sort of prepare for that, the better. my husband and I were not very prepared for it. And I think that probably made the process of recovery quite a lot more painful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think to prepare and to talk about it, I mean, since I know some of my friends and I, we talked about having a kind of a funeral party where we talk about how what we want in our funerals and what, so we can hear that and we can plan it in a way that's a celebration. And God forbid, let's hope that we all last longer, but just to start a conversation about it. I know in America they have things called death parties where people also, which is not about planning your funeral, but also that people can get together who have been bereaved, can start talking about their grief and can start to feel connected again. So I think there can be creative ways to help each other and support each other. And just bring it up, as you say, in society where we can start talking about it rather than burying it or running away from it, which is part of the isolation. So
definitely.
But one of our readers is here saying, even before the pandemic, I thought it would be useful to have those mourning bands people used to wear on their arms after the war to show people they had lost a loved one without having to say so. I think, again, that what a lovely idea. I mean, maybe it's a time in this, as we're sort of losing so many people with the COVID virus, of maybe finding new ways to help people who are grieving. Absolutely. Juliet, thank you so much for your time today. Your book is lovely. I haven't quite finished it yet. And even now I find it painful to read, about losing loved ones.
I'm sure, yeah.
But The State of Disbelief is available now. Thank you for your wisdom today. And I hope we're going to share this to all of our communities. And I hope that your kind of kind words will struck a chord for lots of people who may be suffering out there. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. It's been a real honor.
Goodbye.
Okay, bye.